This is Professor Richardson with an overview of the material on the website that's shared by Professor Richardson and Professor McConkey for MGTC11. Next week on the 18th, both of us will be dealing with chapter number 8, but rather than have it attend a class, we invite you to look through these different subsections of the website which have detailed information on chapter 8. So in a sense, your class on the 18th in Richardson's class and on the 15th in McConkey's class will be online. You don't have to come, just read the material on the website. So this is an overview. The first section is on privacy issues. I want you to read through the entire section here, which talks about privacy violations and why it's important to understand that, how protecting privacy makes business sense. We'll talk about consumer records that are lost and stolen and how that's important. There's an interview that I gave here about the do not call list, which you can listen to the MP3 of that. We also talk about how increased personalization of ads is here despite privacy concerns, and also talk about Google's Streetscape with a very interesting example there of some pictures that Google has picked up. We'll also talk about the Canadian Privacy Commissioner and how she's concerned about how Americans have access to our cell phone logs, and other information in that section on privacy issues. Then there is a section on actual privacy violations. It's very short, but simply tells you the difference between the different types of targeted attacks, whether it's personal, corporate, or national, and data harvesting and traffic analysis. And then we talk about email filtering, which is one of the technologies that companies do to monitor employee use of email, which is something some people might be concerned about, and I tell you the truth of whether or not you need to be concerned about whether U of T people are reading your email. And the next section talks about the different types of IT risks and threats. So you have some range of whether they're criminal attacks, privacy violations, publicity attacks, and so on. That's sort of a big picture perspective. And then we get into also internal risks and threats, which was also mentioned in the context of outsourcing, because there is that vulnerability. Basically, internal risks is divided into 3 categories, which are explained here in some detail with some interesting examples like the one at Coca-Cola. And then we'll talk about encryption, which is one of the things that people do to protect against information being accessed. We'll talk about cryptography being a family of technologies involving encryption, decryption, authentication, and digital signatures, and an explanation of what a digital signature is and why cryptography is important for MIS people to understand. Read this section on the Scotiabank website about the 5 components of security. Then we'll talk about viruses. Viruses are not about destroying computers anymore. They're usually about harvesting information for use in identity theft. There's some very interesting up-to-date things here about email viruses and smartphone viruses, which you should read through thoroughly. Then we have a section on scams. Now you may think that you're not going to get scammed because you're a smart university student, but there's a number of very interesting tricks in here that talk about the different types of scams, and here's some videos some students made talking about variations of them. We'll also talk about the Nigerian scam, which is quite well known, and variations of that coming from other countries. And then some scams that are based upon pass-along rate, so that people can harvest email addresses, which can also relate to identity theft and scam. This one here is something that you should read because it was based on a real one that had a lot of proselytization in the Toronto area a number of years ago. Then we'll talk about DNS attacks, was one of the ways to bring down a server, which is something you should know how to defend against, or at least understand the basics of what the threat is. And spyware. Spyware is what is usually launched by those spam emails that are sent by people to pass along, and the purpose of what spyware is trying to accomplish. And then we'll talk about firewalls, which is one of the preventative things. And basically I just simply want you to understand the basic structure of firewalls here, what they can and cannot do, and the 2 basic types of static firewalls and the dynamic firewalls. Firewalls is mentioned very briefly in your textbook in chapter number 8. And patches. Patches is information in updating software so you can use it more effectively in fix errors that are reported. It's very important that students do upload the patches so they don't end up in vulnerabilities. This explains that software patching lags far behind the discovered vulnerabilities. There's a very interesting story here from UTM. And lastly, social engineering, which is the way that people trick people into surrendering passwords and other confidential information. There's 3 or 4 very interesting examples here from students talking about social engineering scams. Watch this little video here which talks about how some people fake people on the street into surrendering cash deposits to the bank. That's a section on social engineering. So if you read all those links, you'll have gone through all the material in Chapter 8 that's relevant and the things that you're going to be tested on the final exam for both the students in Professor Richardson's class and in Professor McConkey's class.